Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's NAC at Home program. My name is Nadine Heidinger, and I'm the Director of Communications at the National Arts Club. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we are a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org, or you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. On behalf of our literary committee, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, a conversation and reading with historian and author Charles Spencer, who will be discussing his latest book, The White Ship. Today's conversation will once again be led by skilled moderator and host of the New York City-based Page Turners reading series, Glenn Rauscher. The White Ship can be purchased from a preferred independent bookseller, Books on Call, via a link we'll be sharing in the chat. Following the conversation will be a brief Q&A, so please feel free to use the Q&A function for any questions you might have. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Glenn. Please enjoy the conversation.
Nadine, thank you very much. My name is Glenn Rauscher, the host of the Page Turners reading series here in New York City. I do want to again say thank you to Nadine and Rose from National Arts Club for trusting me with this hour of their wonderful at-home series. It is a Wednesday afternoon in New York and around the world. Maybe it's early evening, somewhere places where people are listening. We know it's an international audience today. And those of us involved in this event know that you could be in 10,000 different places doing 10,000 different things. And we don't take for granted for a moment that you've chosen to spend your time with us. And we wanted to thank you very, very much for that. Your reward is to have an hour with the author of The White Ship, Charles Spencer. As Nadine mentioned, we do want you to be part of this hour in a meaningful way. Please put your questions in the Q&A on the bottom of the Zoom screen, and I do want to emphasize questions, please. We cannot get to all of them. We'll get to as many as we can, and please note, if I do not choose your question, it is not personal. We will also not get to all 154 of my questions. Again, books are available from Books on Call NYC. Look for the link directly to their bookshop.org store in the chat. All formats are available. This is the gift-giving season, and please remember that New York City, at least, has a 2-book minimum law. And now on to our author. Charles Spencer's The White Ship is a gem of storytelling, extraordinary research, and above all, a compelling tale that emphasizes that no matter your standing, and here we're looking at some of the most powerful people on the planet at the time, life is tenuous, difficult, and can take unimaginable turns at a moment's notice. Despite describing events and people from over 900 years ago now, there are haunting echoes of life as lived today. Power in the hands of the barbaric and shrewd, with backroom deals undergirded by ever-shifting alliances. The lives of the non-ruling population acted upon by those with incredible power and resources to do both good and great evil. Generosity and pettiness, and interfamilial warfare with the greatest stakes imaginable. Charles also ably immerses us in the medieval world so deeply that we also never forget just how different this life was. Charles Spencer ably takes us from the era of William the Conqueror through much time with Henry I and his rancorous relationship with his brothers, with fighting, dying, and the rule of the land at stake at every moment, his long rule, and to the emergence after the sinking of the White Ship and the loss of the intended heir of Henry's nephew, who comes to disastrous, anarchic rule despite his uncle's stated wishes, and then another Henry, whose reign ushers in 300 years of relative peace. It's a remarkable story told with riveting vitality. Please join me in welcoming Charles Spencer.
Thank you, Glenn. Well, I thought I'd set the scene, if I may, with a reading of the prologue. It's just a couple of pages, but really when you're writing a book with this broader narrative, as Glenn's just explained so kindly and beautifully, the key thing is to get the reader to the nub of the story as quickly as possible. So I'm going to read you the prologue of The White Ship, and I called it A Cry in the Dark. Looking back on this, a night whose repercussions would change Europe's history forever, some claim to remember nothing more than a distant noise. It had skimmed across the surface of the icy sea, the sound waves amplified by the stillness of the water, their notes hammered taut by the frost of a late November night. It caught in the northerly wind and perhaps reached the ears of those awake on King Henry I's ship, a dozen nautical miles ahead of the voyage across the Channel. Those who claim to have heard it in the dark would admit that they have had no idea of what it was. It was shrill and short-lived, like the distant squawk of a passing gull. The same noise had made it back to shore, only a mile away, in a clearer form. Some in the Norman harbour of Barfleur heard it. They were near the point where they had earlier watched the port's finest vessel, the White Ship, cast off into the night. Her departure had attracted a crowd. Some present were related to those on board and had come to say their farewells, while others were intrigued by the glamour and power of those putting out to sea. These passengers included Henry I's sole legitimate son, William, the 17-year-old heir to the Kingdom of England and to the Duchy of Normandy. Two of the king's many illegitimate children, who were openly acknowledged and loved by him, were also aboard the White Ship. With the trio of royal children sailed much of the flower of the Anglo-Norman aristocracy, as well as leading bureaucrats who made Henry's realms run smoothly, and celebrated knights who kept the peace while protecting its borders. The distinguished passengers had spent much of the afternoon and evening in the harbour, drinking hard and encouraging the crew to join in the revelry. Those in Barfleur who heard the noise assumed the merriment was reaching a crescendo on the White Ship out at sea, and headed for the warmth of home, unsurprised and unconcerned by the cry in the dark. In fact, what these witnesses to history had heard at sea and on land was a collective scream for help. The passengers of the White Ship had gone from wild festivity to dire panic in an instant, when they realized the crunch that had brought the vessel to a grinding halt was a rock that had pierced the timbers, leaving a gaping hole and allowing water to pour in. This caused the White Ship to heave to one side, making her spill her human cargo into the shockingly cold sea. Perhaps the lowliest of those on board was Barreau, a butcher from Rouen, who had pursued his social superiors onto the ship, determined to get outstanding bills settled. Barreau clung to part of the White Ship's mast. Then, despite the weight of his saturated goatskin tunic, he hauled himself from the freezing waves onto his life-saving perch. Next to him clambered Geoffrey de l'Aigle, a nobleman who was one of the king's illustrious knights. The unlikely pair had rescued themselves from drowning, but now they lay vulnerable to the extreme cold. They shivered uncontrollably. In the moonlight, they watched as their companions cried out and thrashed in the water, desperate for life. Barreau would later note William, the prince, getting safely away in the White Ship's small boat. The quick-thinking royal bodyguards had bundled him into it and were rowing hard for land, aware that their sole duty in this unfurling disaster was to preserve the life of the king-to-be. They had even left the royal treasure chest behind in the White Ship's hold. As William headed quickly to safety, Barreau and de l'Aigle watched with mounting horror as the tragedy around them played out.
Thank you for that. I think that gives people a sort of a wonderful taste of the apex of the book. I was curious, what led you to this story? What made you want to write this particular book now?
I'd always known this story, The White Ship. To be honest, I'm probably among the last generation of English people who had a compulsory history education and a broad one at that. And I've always had an absolute passion for history. As a little boy, I read a book called Our Island Story, which was a very sort of old-fashioned book about the history of England from the Roman conquest to the death of Queen Victoria. And the chapter on Henry I, who is a brilliant king and a not very nice man, but one of the greater kings of medieval England. The chapter on him really centered on this disaster of the White Ship. I can remember the illustration and it really haunting me. And then of disaster coming up. And you like
Charles, we lost you for a moment. I don't know if it's a bad connection. But
yes, I Aaron quite loudly. I don't know if that's your end.
Okay. I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
Was
I'm so sorry. Can you hear me as well as the fire engines as well?
Oh. 5 years ago, just by chance, I was asked to give a keynote speak at Leeds Castle down in the south of England. And it was on the Queens of England. And one of the people I wanted to include in the story was the woman who could have become and should have become queen once the White Ship disaster had happened. So it was a combination of having my interest in this story reignited by the speech and the ability to go to my publishers and say, look, this is a seriously interesting, almost forgotten story that should please have an audience today.
One of the challenges I'm sure you faced as both a writer and researcher is how did you, in looking at the story, because you mentioned the kind of history book you read when you were a youth and the particular kind of way it told the story. How did you get to verifiable facts as much as you could and tell a story that you believed to be as accurate and as important as this one is to you?
Well, I have written a few books before, and my last 3 history books were on the English Civil War of the 1640s. And then you're dealing with very conflicting sources and an enormous number of them. The difference with this book, The White Ship, was that there's very few primary sources, obviously because it's 900 years ago. They're all the ones I dealt with were written by churchmen and one churchwoman, in fact, chroniclers who were in the monasteries of France and Normandy, who were literate, who had the time and means to write these reports, and there was no shortage. I mean, literally all of the people who were writing at this time about great matters of Europe, this was a huge headline. I think this was a sort of earth-stopping, sort of earth-shattering moment that the King of England, who was the most powerful man in Europe at this time, apart from perhaps the Pope, had done so much to build up in 20 years all of the great dynastic hopes of his time. He had established his right to the throne. He had done so much, and then he loses it. He loses everything. So the chroniclers, and we're dealing, I think it's an important backdrop to this whole story, all the chroniclers were deeply religious. They saw the hand of God in every act and everything that was happening in Europe. And they were transfixed by the scale of this disaster. So there are 9 of them. There are literally 9, and that's who I drew upon. And then what you have to do when you're putting together a story like this is work out what is the most likely truth here in terms of the detail. And there was one chronicler who I believe must have met Barrow the Butcher, who we just met clutching the mast. He actually ends up being the sole survivor of the White Ship disaster, because what we get is a very clear eyewitness account of this disaster unraveling. Was
that Orderic Vitalis?
Orderic Vitalis, unlikely name, but a wonderful eyewitness to history. He was born up in the northwest of England. His father was extremely religious, and decided that he needed to sacrifice the family's happiness to guarantee Orderic's future place in heaven. So he was sent to live in a monastery and serve in a monastery in Normandy. He never forgot his English roots, and so he covered English stories in his history with incredible detail and interest.
What was the role of the church and religion in the rulers and citizens at this time?
Well, in England, the church was immensely powerful. We know from Domesday Book, which was a record of all the property in England in 1086, which William the Conqueror wanted to have done so he knew where his revenue could be sourced from, that the church owned 25% of England. The papacy had undertaken quite a resurgence since the 1070s. Before that, it had lapsed to a rather quiet and tired state. But there was a Pope Gregory in the late 1870s was determined to re-establish the church. We then see the papacy mounting the First Crusade at the end of the 11th century, which again gave it enormous prestige and control over the royal and aristocratic houses of Europe. And we see the day-to-day change in what was acceptable and what wasn't, because the church was establishing itself in the fact that the most famous man of this period, William the Conqueror, who wins England in 1066, was born in, but by the time of the, within a generation, that would have been impossible. The church is insisting on the basic sacraments as being the tenets which people should base their lives on, and marriage was one of them, and children born out of wedlock were not considered eligible for
How can people today in our sometimes civilized society understand how brutal life could be and the levels of violence that existed during the time this book covers?
Well, they can watch Game of Thrones, and although
after reading your book, they can watch Game of Thrones only.
I think it's been well established that Game of Thrones was based on a lot of it was based on the savagery of English history in around this period. I mean, it is astonishing. When I was writing this, I've always been really intrigued by man's ability to be really cruel to man, and of course that still exists today. But the barbarism you mention is definitely a standout fact from this period. And I mentioned how the church had established itself around now, and the church wanted leniency when it came to taking people's lives out of justice. So we end up with other forms of extreme punishment. And the pages of this book reflect an enormous number of mutilations, castrations, blindings, and really horrendous ways of dealing with people. And it's just astonishing that this was going on then. But, you know, there are some places in the world where very cruel things still happen today.
Were there any rules of warfare at the time? You describe more or less constant investitures and attacks on castles and counterattacks. And were there any actual rules when it seems like the book says, or what the book talks about is the cliche of to the victor go the spoils and the right to destroy life and property is pleased?
Yeah, well, the rules were flexible, really. In Europe, they became more established. Not a rule, but a custom would be that if you were given the opportunity to surrender your castle or your town, if you declined that offer, you were asking for it. You'd better win. Because, of course, the investment needed to capture a besieged area was huge in terms of provisions and life. And you basically gave up your right to mercy if you didn't surrender. And then you're dealing with an enormous amount of self-interest. And that's when I say the rules changed a bit. There are times in my book where the really mighty men, the Duke of Normandy and the King of England are about to fight. And the barons take it out of their hands. Because what we have to remember at this period in England, we're in the post-Battle of Hastings period, where a lot of men who supported William the Conqueror from Normandy and risked everything on invading England, they got huge payouts in terms of property and rights. So they were straddling, their estates were on both sides of the Channel. And so occasionally the barons would say, we're not fighting. We're not fighting for one of the two brothers who are fighting at the moment because we could lose everything. And actually, we don't really care about who's in charge. We just want peace and the ability to exist in a peaceful climate. And that's another thing, you know, apart from the religious aspect, I think one of the things I'd like to get across in this talk is what an incredibly desirable commodity peace was for people. Whether it's your monk in his monastery or your man or woman field, you wanted to have the security of knowing you weren't going to be attacked, raped, or have your property taken away. And with Henry I, he is who is the sort of backdrop to the story. He's William the Conqueror's fourth son, becomes King of England. He is an incredibly cruel wielder of justice, but people respected him for this because it meant that they could go about their business. And the great saying during Henry I's reign was that a young girl carrying a purse of gold could go from one end of the kingdom to the other without being molested. And that was, you were prepared to sacrifice a lot of rights in return for that.
One of the things that comes across really strongly in the book is how gifted a politician, pretty much in the modern sense, Henry was. What made him so?
I think Henry I is a fascinating king of England because he was never meant to be that. He was the fourth son. One of the other brothers died young. So he ends up being the third son. And on the deathbed of William the Conqueror, William gives his eldest son Normandy, his second son England, and third son Henry I, he gives him some silver. And Henry's very upset about this. And he says, look, I'm your most loyal son. And this doesn't seem like a fair compensation. And William the Conqueror says, well, you will one day be greater than both your brothers. I think he always had potential. It was very easy to overlook Henry. He was considered a very learned man, and that wasn't particularly valued in a court where warfare was the prime aim. He turned out to be incredibly clever. You're quite right. When he became King of England, he managed to sort out problems of revenue, taxation. He established the Exchequer, which is still a system of taxation in England 900 years later. He was very good. He appointed people by merit, and this was very unusual. He realized that the very powerful aristocracy on both sides of the Channel couldn't really be relied on. They had too much self-interest and too much power. So he brought in essentially a parallel system of power in the community through men he promoted from nothing. And they owed everything to Henry, which is a very clever system of patronage, which you're quite right, would sit well with politicians today.
Of course, not everybody was happy with Henry or was interested in allying with him. I think one of the most fascinating characters in this book is someone who was one of his, I think, great antagonists, which was Robert de Belem. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes. What a character.
Go ahead.
He is,
sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you touched on him because he is fascinating because he's so dark. And he underestimated Henry. He thought when Henry seized the throne unexpectedly in 1100, he thought, well, I'm not going to have to listen to this young boy who we don't know much about. But Henry set about defeating him. Robert de Belem was completely out of control. I think part of the fascination for me with de Belem was that out of the huge majority of people who were so God-fearing, this was a God-fearing time with a terrible version of a Christian God very much in people's minds. This was an Old Testament brutal God who would attack and smite you down if you did wrong. De Belem didn't believe in God. So that made him free to do what he thought he wanted to do. And he was immensely cruel and arrogant. And there is a chapter in the book where we find Robert de Belem being told off by the religious men of his area of Normandy for not observing Lent. And de Belem says to the monks who come to see him, well, what should I do? And They said, well, you should fast. And so de Belem starves to death the 300 prisoners in his dungeons as a sort of twisted version of fasting. He's a very strange man. And I'm not sufficiently up into, he's psychotic, I would imagine, but he's certainly worse than just plain psychotic. He's a really bad man.
I think you describe him in a word that has a lot of modern parlance as a toxic presence.
Yes, and this is, I'm sorry to upset your audience today, but there was a time when he'd lost his temper with a man who was a friend of his. And the man's son was staying with de Belem. He was de Belem's godson. And de Belem tears the boy's eyes out with his fingers. And you just think, my goodness, this is Hannibal Lecter, not a 12th century lord.
Can you touch on their conflict was not as interpersonally violent as what you just described, and I think it's also describing. I don't think you need to apologize. You're describing reality. People should be forewarned when they open the pages of the book that not everything is like that, but there is a lot of very well described violence and retribution in the book. Can you briefly talk about the three brothers, the sons of William, Rufus, Curthose, and Henry, and what led to their conflicts and how they played out through each of their lives and sort of the costs to each of them of these conflicts?
Yes, well, this is, again, a modern reference. You're dealing with, it's a family like the family in Succession on television, but with enormous power. So William the Conqueror is a fascinating titan of 11th century Europe. He is also an intriguing human being. He's very religious, and he has a wonderful wife and a very happy marriage, and has 9, perhaps 10 children, but he has 4 sons. One of these, Richard, is lost to history. He dies in a hunting accident as a young boy. And then you're left with 3 incredibly different characters. Robert Curthose is the eldest son. He's called Curthose. It's a cruel nickname coined by William the Conqueror for his son because he has very short legs. And he is really not cut out for leadership at all. He's too nice, I think. And people chastised him when he was Duke of Normandy for just giving too much away to his cronies, his hangers-on. And then the second son is completely different. William Rufus. He's called Rufus, we think, because of his red hair and his ruddy complexion. He is William the Conqueror's favorite son. I think part of this is because he's a very brave warrior, but he's amoral. He is in charge of, well, not in charge. He leads a court that do not want to have visiting your locality. When William Rufus and his men come to stay wherever you are, you run to the woods because your daughters are going to get raped and your property is going to be destroyed. And then the third son, Henry, is completely different. He has the family passion for hunting, and people see him as this rather quirky, high-born figure who is probably not going to do much. He likes to go off hunting by himself and with his own pack of hounds. And he's got a sort of common touch, and he can read, which is thought as overly intellectual at the time. But when he becomes king, he reveals all of his extremely shrewd characteristics and his ability to control. And essentially, after William the Conqueror's death, there is a constant fight between Robert Curthose, who gets Normandy, and William Rufus, who gets England. Curthose, who has so many problems in his life and in his realm, is persuaded to go off on the First Crusade, where he does very well in battle. William Rufus is killed in the second of the Conqueror's sons to die in a hunting accident in 1100. And the 2 elder brothers, Curthose and Rufus, have made a pact that if either of them dies without having a legitimate son, the other one gets their realm as well. But Henry dives in, takes the opportunity, captures England, in England's crown, and becomes King of England, and eventually becomes Duke of Normandy. Henry turns out to be the really able one, and he is an opportunist who is very effective.
One word that you just said that I kept thinking about when I was reading the book is opportunity. It strikes me in this book that the powerful were always on the lookout for the main chance. And many of them seem to be willing to risk a great deal for just the opportunity to seize power. What did that stem from, and where did it tend to lead people?
Life was very brutish and quite short at this time. You'll see a lot of the customs revolving around the aristocratic families at this time are looking at the real problems of leaving widows and orphans, because the husbands were at war, fighting, and they would die in battle, and you're left with these things. So you're dealing with a culture where you better seize the main chance, because otherwise your enemy is going to, and then you're done for. It's a dog-eat-dog world, and it's brutal in the extreme. I think religion was a comfort, that however awful life was in medieval England and France and Normandy, because they were separate then, you still had the chance of salvation later on if you led a decent life. And, you know, it was a very difficult time when somebody got ill. So William, there was a very limited sense of medical knowledge. William the Conqueror dies a lingering death after being struck in the belly by the pommel on the front of his saddle. He had become a very large man, and the pommel hit him hard. Henry, his son, Henry I, eventually dies from, looks like a sort of very, very strong case of indigestion. And you've got ignorant doctors, you know. So even if you were privileged, you had to be careful. You have the king. In fact, this is a book about the King of England's son dying in a shipwreck. His opposite number, the King of France, loses his son, again in the book, in a even more humdrum accident. He's riding fast through the outskirts of Paris when a pig shoots out under his horse, and he gets thrown by his horse and breaks his neck. So there are endless ways to die young. As I mentioned, 2 of the conqueror's 4 sons died in riding and hunting accidents. People weren't thinking of old age, and they were thinking of the present and the afterlife. You find actually a lot of the bloodiest soldiers at this time, the great knights and lords who've really slain a lot of people in their lives, they look, when they know they're really at the end of their days, even if it's for a few days, they will retire to a monastery in the hope that they will finally reach heaven.
I love that you took a question which I was thinking about, sort of the political aspect, and you made it very human, because you made it about seizing life.
Thank you, Glenn. I do think that the main driving force for my interest in history is the humans, you know. You quite rightly cast this story as you know, it is 900 years ago, but there's very little about humans that's changed in those 900 years in terms of expectations and triumphs and terrors and defeats and all of these things. And so my job really in this book was to take these names of people who died nearly a millennium ago and bring them to life as people. And that's not just the great people, it's those who had to suffer under their greed and power.
Henry and Queen Matilda's firstborn was named William, and I hope I pronounced this right, Etheling, correct?
Yes.
What was the import of his birth, and how was the relationship between King Henry and his son William?
Well, it's very important. I mean, it's hard for us to understand, but really the prime duty of a monarch at this time was to produce an unchallengeable male heir. And I looked into this because Henry I also has a daughter, Matilda, who comes into play as a potential queen later on. But really, it's very difficult for at this time to consider a queen in her own right. So a boy is key. William Atheling is born in 1103, 3 years into his parents' marriage. It's apparently a love match. That's what the chroniclers say, but you have to be wary of what the chroniclers say, because they lionize the royalty and aristocracy at this time. I can't tell you how beautiful all the women are and how muscular and handsome all the men are, if you believe the chroniclers. So anyway, it may or may not have been a love match. She was a princess of Scotland, Henry I's wife, and her father actually is the man who killed the real Macbeth. And you end up with this perfect marriage in a way, because although she's a princess of Scotland, half her blood goes back to Alfred the Great in England. So Henry I marries her, bringing together the invading Norman blood in his veins and the ancient kings of England. And so everyone, there was a vision that was had in 1066 by Edward the Confessor, the king who died in the year of the Battle of Hastings. And he had a vision that the tree of England would be torn in two, but one day soon it would be brought back together. And a lot of people believed that William, this prince who was born of Henry I and his Scottish wife, was the realization of that vision, that he was going to pull everything together and make all of England happy again.
What was the relationship? You describe it in really wonderful ways in the book between Henry and his son.
Well, he was an unusually doting father, Henry. We know this anyway. I mentioned in that prologue, which I read out, but he had many illegitimate children and he loved them, but he particularly loved his son, William. We know Henry I spent an absolutely extraordinary amount of his 35-year rule overseas, fighting in Normandy. And in time, he took his son with him. But when he used to have to go, when the boy was 5 or 6, he would write to the Archbishop of Canterbury, the senior churchman in England, and beg him, please, keep an avuncular eye on my boy. And he really did love him. And this is rare at this time. As I mentioned, William the Conqueror had a very complicated and actually bloody relationship with his eldest son. But Henry I really loved the boy and took him on campaign. He's signing, his seal is on documents as a young man. He's with his father on the great campaigns as a teenager in France. So Henry invested everything in bringing this young boy on to be the perfect king.
By 1120, Henry's rule is pretty well undisputed. He's conquered many of his enemies. He's brought a serious degree of stability to the lands that he rules over. Where do we stand after the Battle of Bremeux?
The Battle of Bremeux in the summer of 1119 is really the climax of Henry's happiness. He has settled everyone in England. He's getting good revenue in England. He's won Normandy in 1106. But in 1119, he beats his great adversary, Louis the Fat of France, who is determined to pull apart the English and Norman union. And he tries to do this through having other contenders for the Norman throne brought forward. It's quite complicated. I think I have to explain just very briefly that the King of France is not king of the France we know today. He's king of a small area around Paris called the Ile-de-France, and he has a notional overlordship for Brittany and Anjou and Maine and Normandy. But in Bremeux, Henry I beats Louis in battle, and Louis has no option but to acknowledge William Atheling as the future Duke of Normandy. So this is really Henry's life work completed.
And this should theoretically set up the future for Henry and his family. How did medieval people view the sea?
Wow. Well, the sea, it's so interesting because it's so obvious when you think about it. They knew so little about the sea. Your veteran captains of ships would know the stars and they would read the signs of a storm coming. But just imagine, this is an era when nobody's seen anything under the sea. I mean, you might see the fish swimming, but there is no way of really getting a picture of the sea. So the medieval mind sees the sea as a place of great beauty, but huge danger. And I'd love to read a little bit about the attitude to the sea, because this is really an answer to your question, put in a much more poetic and contemporary way. This is written by a 12th century poet, and it is from his book, The Roman de Bru, and it goes like this. It gives a picture of the sea and the ships and all of those who were about to get on board. There the ships were gathered and the troops assembled. You would have seen many ships being prepared, ships moored, ships anchored, ships beached and ships launched, ships being pegged and nailed together, cordage spread out, masts raised, gangplanks put over the side, and ships loaded, helmets, shields, hauberks carried, lances raised, horses led, knights and servants boarding, and one friend calling out to another. They exchanged many greetings, those who are staying behind and those departing. When all had gone aboard the ship, and they had the tide and a fair wind, then you would have seen anchors raised, cables hauled, shrouds tied down, sailors clambering around on board, unfurling canvas and sails. Some strain at the windlass, others with a sail pin and tacking spar. And then you listen to the rest of the poem, setting the scene of what it's like to go on a voyage. But what you're not getting is what's going on in people's heart and mind. And you see that the voyages at this time, such as the key voyage in this, which is the doomed voyage of the White Ship, priests come to bless the ship before its departure and bless those on board, because it's thought so dangerous out there on the waves that you need God's support. If you look at the maps of this time, you are seeing extraordinary creatures drawn on there. From mermaids, they did believe in mermaids luring sailors onto the rock, but under the waves, you have fantastical beasts, the marine equivalents of wolves and elephants and snakes just waiting to destroy you if you fall into the water. And to the medieval mind, there was another aspect to this. Drowning was considered the most painful way of dying. And at the same time, when you were drowning, when you were thrashing around for the final time, you wouldn't have time, or perhaps the presence of mind, you couldn't possibly say your penance. So you were being condemned to a vile death and to hell. So the fear of the sea was really huge. And in fact, I got to grips with a lot of poetry at this time, and it is a consistent theme, the terror of the sea. People did not swim for leisure. And the only people I find who can swim at this period are those who are intricately connected with, say, the fishing industry. They're used to retrieving snagged nets, but nobody else could. So you're dealing with an absolutely terrifying environment.
Tell us a little bit about the White Ship itself, and you talk about it in the introduction, the prologue you read. In addition to William Etherling, who and what were on the Blanche Neuve?
Yes. Well, the White Ship was a fantastically impressive vessel. It's quite clear from the accounts of the time that it was white. I imagine that means it was lime washed rather than painted white. It was extremely large. So we know that William the Conqueror's flagship, the Mora, which sailed across the Channel in 1066, we know that had 16 oarsmen as well as the sails. To put this in context, the White Ship would have been a similar design, but it had 50 oarsmen, and it was the great ship of the Norman coast. And it was bizarrely, it was captained by the son of the man who had captained William the Conqueror's invading ship in 1066. On board were, apart from 50 sailors who were considered extremely good veterans of their craft, you had 300 passengers from the Prince William and an illegitimate half-brother, illegitimate half-sister, Henry I's nephews and nieces, great generals from his recent triumphs, the great bureaucrats who looked after his kingdom, the Earl of Chester, who was the most senior aristocrat, and his wider family were on board. And it's an astonishing range of people, churchmen as well. They were really the cream of the crop. They were the prince's chosen party to go back in triumph to England. You couldn't have had, and apart from the king himself, it would have been very hard to have had a more distinguished group on board. But the absolute nub of this whole thing is that the one legitimate male heir was on board, and there was no one to replace him.
There was a question in the Q&A where someone asked about, did Henry have any say on who was on that ship, and did he not see the potential for disaster by putting so much of the core of what made him, in addition to his own skills, a great king in one very dangerous place? Did he have any thought about it?
That's so difficult to know. I would say, the evidence would say that he hadn't thought it through. Shipwrecks were common. I mean, there are a lot of shipwrecks in this book. Not all fatal, but they happened. One of the most compromising aspects of King Harold's competition against William the Conqueror was that he became William the Conqueror's prisoner after a shipwreck earlier in the piece. Well, Henry I must have known there was a constant danger with going across the Channel. This was very late in the year to be going across, but actually the seas were calm. The wind was absolutely correct for a 10 or 12 hour voyage from Barfleur in Normandy across to Southampton in England. It seems that Henry was very relaxed when his ship made it back to England. He retired to one of his favorite hunting lodges and just waited for his son and other children and everyone else on board the white ship to join him. And it was after a day and a half when they hadn't that he started to get concerned. By this stage, the courtiers knew what had happened, but they were terrified of him. He was a very frightening king, and they didn't want to be the one to give him the bad news. And in the end, one of Henry's surviving nephews persuaded a page boy to hand the devastating news to Henry, and he bellowed in agony and fell to the floor. And I think that touches back to an earlier point you prompted me with, which is the dynastic impact of that ship going down was huge. But he really loved his son and his other children on board. And actually, he loved his generals. He loved so many of those people on board, and it broke him. People said that for the remaining 15 years of his life, he never smiled again. Of course, that can't have been the case, but he was in grief for the rest of his life.
Yeah, I think you mentioned in the book that one of his trusted aides who was not on the journey actually came to him and sort of shook him out of his torpor.
Yes, he said, all you're doing by sobbing like this, you can't bring them back. You're just making your enemies stronger, and you've got a job to do, and you better do it. So one of the first things Henry did, he was a widower by this stage, was find a new bride and try to have another male legitimate heir. And he marries this a woman who is considered a great beauty from the lowlands, the Netherlands. She's called Adeliza. He marries her, and she stays by the king's side, the chroniclers say coyly, but nothing happens. She cannot have a child with Henry I. Later on, after Henry dies, she goes on to have half a dozen children with another man. Maybe the king was too grief-stricken for procreation.
Who benefited from the disaster?
Well, benefited. Henry, it drove him, it became the driving force for the last phase of his life, was to try and find a solution. He knew his duty was to make sure there wasn't a divided succession, because that way anarchy lay. So having realized after a few years that he was not going to father any more children with his new bride, he tried to persuade, well, he did persuade the great churchmen and nobility on both sides of the Channel that they had to look to his only other legitimate child, who is Matilda, who was by this stage widowed. She had been the Empress of Germany, effectively. She's widowed, and she is made the focus of Henry's dynastic ambitions. But when Henry dies in 1135, bizarrely, the one man of great note who got off the White Ship is Henry I's nephew, Stephen of Blois, races across the Channel and seizes the throne for himself. And he got off the White Ship because he had an upset stomach that night. And that saved his life, because he, of course, would have been among the drowned. And people liked Stephen. He was an affable man, and he had a way of talking to people from all backgrounds. But he was a disastrous king. He was too nice again, and he didn't follow through. When he defeated his enemies, he let them off. And this was just not acceptable. In an era where power was mainly about sort of shock and awe, really, and setting examples, he was revealing that he was actually not strong enough. And it was at this point, after 3 years of Stephen's increasingly inept rule, that people did look for a possible successor in Matilda. But I think the real beneficiary of the White Ship only becomes apparent in 1154, and that's when Stephen and Matilda's eldest son, Henry II, comes to the throne, and he is a Plantagenet from Anjou, but he's a Plantagenet, and as you said in your introduction, he's the first of the Plantagenet rulers of England in 1154, and they go through 1485, the Plantagenets, until the Tudors take over.
You described Stephen's reign in the book as a time of anarchy and civil war, and that Stephen's inability to be an effective leader contributed mightily to that. What else caused it? What was Matilda's part in it? And I know that in the book you describe how she briefly came tantalizingly close to rule, but never quite got there. What happened in the interim between Stephen taking over and Henry II sort of restoring the kind of order that Henry I had brought about?
Well, you have in Matilda, you have a very able potential ruler. She just happened to be female, and this was considered very problematic. So all of the great men who had sworn to acknowledge her as Henry I's successor just fell away to start with, and they allowed Stephen a free run, really, at the throne. And Matilda is a fascinatingly brave person. I love that, just to illustrate her character. There is one point in this really bloody civil war between her and she is holed up in the castle in Oxford, and it's clear about to be captured. Her garrison are on the point of mutiny. The castle is surrounded. It's midwinter. The snow's on the ground. And Matilda thinks, no, I'm not going to surrender. She confides in her two greatest knights that they're going to make a break for it. And it's very cinematic, actually. She and they cover themselves in white sheets in the English winter, lower themselves down the side of the castle in Oxford, and manage to get through the surrounding army to safety. She is strong, particularly in adversity. She's less good when things are going well for her. So there is a period where she has King Stephen, and then later she is about to be crowned queen when essentially the people of London won't have it. They find her arrogant, they find her haughty, they find her all sorts of things which would not have been a problem if she was a man. But in a woman, it's considered unladylike, and they rebel against her. Because I can tell you, her father, Henry I, was certainly arrogant and overbearing, and William the Conqueror was quite strong in that department too. But it was somehow unacceptable that a woman should behave like that. And her three greatest supporters, one was a bishop, one was a half-brother of hers who was a brilliant soldier, and the King of Scotland, who was her uncle. They supported her on the assumption that she would just be a token ruler while they did the manly business of ruling. And it's astonishing to us, but that is how they saw it.
One of the questions from very early on in our talk that one of our participants put in there is, Christy Netterman asked this: what part of the White Ship story do you feel has just not been covered at all before? And was it part of the thing that led you to writing this book? Well,
there are lots of little side issues with the White Ship. So I know what the question means, and I'm ignoring that. But to me, the most intriguing thing was one of the offshoots of this tragedy. So there's this absolutely awful moment when William, as in the prologue, is being bundled away to safety in the little lifeboat when he hears his half-sister, the Countess of Perche, crying for help. And this seals his end because he insists that his bodyguards turn the lifeboat back to go and rescue his sister. But of course, you know, we have a sea full of people drowning and they clutch onto the side of the lifeboat and they take it and the prince down with them. And sadly, the Countess of Perche dies too. The Countess, her husband is not on board that ship, and nor are their two little daughters. So the Count of Perche builds an oratory, a place of prayer for their little girls to remember their mother. And that is built at a place in Normandy called La Trappe. And in time, that becomes the mother house of the Trappist monastic movement. So this thriving monastic order, which still exists all over the world today, finds its roots in very directly in the tragedy of the White Ship in 1120.
I'm so glad you mentioned that part of the book, because that you talk about Matilda's escape as being cinematic. William Etheling's turning about, which is the very essence of chivalry and manhood and trying to do the right thing. That also, to me, when I read the book, was just a heart-stopping moment because you knew what was going to happen. So I do want to, again, encourage everybody listening to us today. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to stop your day and listen to Charles talk about this wonderful book. Please buy the book. It is not just a wonderful gift. We were certainly serious about it being a wonderful gift, but it is also a fascinating read and fills in a much needed gap in the history of England and Europe. I wanted to ask you as we wrap, first of all, to say thank you, Charles, for spending an hour with us today. What are you working on next as an author? And can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so I've nearly finished my next book. My books take about 3 years to write, and this one's been quicker. I always, because I tend to look at anniversaries, my publisher always says, please don't say what you're working on, because somebody might write a better book on the same subject in the time before mine comes out. But it is something completely different. I've gone for a 20th century story, and it is, to me, riveting, and who knows, but it'll hopefully be out next year.
Wonderful. Charles, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure talking to you and meeting you. Again, everybody, please buy this book. You will be as riveted as I was in the reading. And unless there's anything else you'd like to add, Charles, we will bid adieu today.
Where riveting, not about my version. I'm talking about the facts being riveting. It's up to, I don't know if I've caught the rivetingness, but I wouldn't want to end with a sort of empty boast at all. But I would like to say thank you, Glenn, for first of all, really reading the book. It meant that the conversation that your audience has had today has been incredibly well led by you. And that's always a huge help to a guest like me. So thank you. And thank you. I would reiterate your thanks to people taking the time to join us this afternoon or this evening where I am.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. And I hope everybody has a wonderful day today and have a good rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.